or Chelsea.
Hello and welcome to Algebra, where today we're going to learn how to factor by grouping. Okay, so let's look at this. 9x parentheses x minus 3. So this means multiply, right? This 9x is being multiplied to this, right? And plus 4 parentheses x minus 3. So that 4 is being multiplied to that, right? So what would be the greatest common factor between these two? Well, it would be this x minus 3. That x minus 3 is being multiplied to that 9x and that 4. So if I took out that x minus 3, what's left over? Well, it's 9x plus 4 is what's left over, right? So see if you can do this one. What's the greatest common factor between these things, right? So that 4x is getting times by x plus 5, and this negative 3 is being times by x plus 5. So what's the greatest common factor? Well, the greatest common factor is x plus 5. So what's left over? 4x minus 3. That 4x and this minus 3 are left over, right? So those are left over. All right, so what we're going to do is this is kind of what grouping like factoring is going to look like, right? And we're going to show you how to do that. And that's another way of factoring. Before we were doing the box method, right? And the box method works great, but not everybody loves it. There's multiple ways to skin a cat, right? So this is another method you can use when you're factoring polynomials. All right, so here's our steps on how to do it. So first, always look for the GCF. Look for a greatest common factor. That's what you want to look for first. Always. All right? And then just like before, we're going to take the first term and the last term, and we're going to multiply them together. All right? And then we're going to look for things that multiply to give us that number, and then add to give us that middle term. And then we're going to rewrite our factored polynomial, but replace the middle term with the factors that we found. And then we're going to break our polynomial into two parts, and then we're going to factor out the GCF for both parts. Okay? So that's how we do that. So let's do an example together. So let's see here. If I had this here, 6x squared plus 34 plus 20, what is my GCF? What's my greatest common factor? Well, my greatest common factor is 2, right? So 2 can be factored out of all those. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, right? So it would be 3x squared. 34 divided by 2 would be 17x. 20 divided by 2 would be 10, right? So 2 is my greatest common factor, and remember, that's part of our answer. So I'm going to write that down here as part of our answer. All right, now just like before, we're going to take our first term and our last term, and we're going to multiply them together. So 3x squared plus 10. What would that give me? Well, that would give me 30x squared, right? And then we want to take this middle term and put it down here, 17x. And just like before, we're going to say what times what gives me 30x squared, but adds to give me 17x. So what times what gives me 30? Well, that would be 15 and 2. That could work, right? And 15 plus 2 gives me 17. Ah, perfect. So 15x and 2x, right? Okay, so what do? Well, we're breaking up this 17x, right? That 17x was our middle term. We're going to break that up into the two things that we just found. We're going to put 15x. I don't know why I wrote the 5 first. So 15x and 2x, right? Because 15x plus 2x is going to get me back to that 17x. All right, so now what I'm going to do, I'm going to break this up into two parts. I have it broken up into two parts with this divider here. Some people would put it in parentheses. They're grouping it together in parentheses like this. All right, and then what you do is you say, all right, in this first group here, what is the greatest common factor? Well, I can see right away that they both have an x, and I can see that they can both be divided by 3. So my greatest common factor would be 3x. So what's left inside of my factor? Well, 3x squared divided by 3x would leave me with 1x. 15x divided by 3x would give me 5. So it'd be plus 5. Right? So now I'm going to look over here. What do these two things have in common? Well, I see that they can both be divided by 2. Right? They can both be divided by 2. So 2x divided by 2 is x, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. So I'd be left with x plus 5. So just like how we did at the very top of our sheet, you can see that this 3x and the x plus 5 are being multiplied together, and this 2 and this x plus 5 are being multiplied together, right? So our greatest common factor between these two terms here is x plus 5. So that is part of our answer, x plus 5. So whatever is left over is also part of our answer. So this 3x and this 2 is the other factor in our answer. So 3x plus 2 is our other factor. All right, so when you are factoring out a polynomial using grouping, the first couple steps is kind of the same. You use GCF, right? And then you take your first and last term and you multiply them to get this term. And then you put your middle term down here and you figure out what times what gives you that and adds to give you that. And then you're breaking it up into two separate groups and finding a GCF between those two groups. That's pretty much what you're doing. All right, let's do another example. All right, so I got 5x squared plus 85x plus 350. Oh, wow. All right, what's our greatest common factor? Well, they're all end in 5 or 0, so my greatest common factor would be 5. So let's pull out that 5. 5x squared divided by 5 would leave me with x squared. 85x divided by 5 would be, what would that be, 17? All right, 17x. And then 350 divided by 5 would give me 70. All right? So remember that 5, the GCF of 5 is part of our answer, right? That's part of our answer. We got to find the other factors. So now, just like before, I'm going to take my first term and I'm going to multiply it to my last term. So 70 times x squared would be 70x squared. And then this middle term is going to go down here, right? So I'm going to say what times what gives me 70 squared, but adds to give me 17. All right, so what times what gives me 70, but adds to give me 17? Well, I know this one. This one's pretty easy. 7x and 10x, right? 7x times 10x will give me 70x squared. 7x plus 10x will give me 17x. So there we go. So now I'm going to rewrite my polynomial, that x squared, but instead of writing that plus 17x, I'm going to write these two things, right? So I'm going to write plus 7x, and I'm going to write plus 10x. Okay? All right, so then now my last term is still stays the same, that plus 70. All right, so now I'm going to group these together. Earlier I told you I like to group, I just group them in parentheses. I group my first two together, and then I group my last two together. And then I say, all right, what in this first group do they have in common? Well, my GCF is x, right? So what's left over? Well, it'll be x plus 7, because I'm taking out an x for each of those. All right, so what does this second thing have in common here? Well, they can both be divided by 10, right? So I can do plus 10, and what's left over? Well, 10x divided by 10 would be x, 70 divided by 10 would be 7, right? And I got both of these parentheses look the same, which is great. That's what I want. I'm going to take that out. That's part of our answer. That x plus 7 is part of our answer. That's the GCF of this polynomial over here. All right, and then whatever's left over is also part of our answer. So this x plus 10 is the other factor of our answer. So x plus 10 is the other part of our answer. All right, let's do one more example together, and then you guys can try the next two on your own. All right. So let's see here. Is there a GCF between any of these? I don't think so. No, there's not. Yeah, because nothing can go into 5 and 17. 17 is a prime number, right? So can't factor out a GCF. So all I do is I take my first term, my last term, I'm going to multiply them together. So 5 times 14 is going to give me 70. 70x squared. And then I'm going to take my middle term and put that down here, negative 17x. All right, so now I see that this one's positive, and I want to see, it would multiply to get me that, and I have to add to get me a negative 17. So if it has to add to give me a negative, the only way that's going to work is if both of these are negative, right? Because negative times a negative will give me a positive, and a negative plus a negative will give me a negative. So what two numbers add together to give me 17, but multiply to give me 70? Well, that would be negative 10x and negative 7x. Okay, so now that I found that out, I'm going to rewrite my polynomial, 5x squared, but instead of that negative 17x, I'm going to write these two things. So negative 10x and minus 7x. And then my last term's going to stay the same, that plus 14. All right, so now I have to group these two together, right? So I'm going to group my first terms together, my first two together, and I'm going to group my last two together. All right, what do these first two have in common? Well, they both have an x, and they can both be divided by 5. So what's left over? Well, an x would be left over here, and negative 10 divided by 5x would be negative 2. Right? All right, so what does these two things have in common? Well, they can both be divided by 7. And remember what I said, I want this one to look exactly the same, my parentheses, right? So I have to get rid of that and make it a negative 7. So that way that would make this an x, and 14 divided by negative 7 will give me a negative 2. That way my factors look the same here, right? And that's part of our answer, right? So that x minus 2 is part of our answer. And then whatever is left over, this and this, are also part of our answer. So 5x minus 7. Okay? So that's our answer. And if we always wanted to check, we could always do like FOIL or something like that to check our work, and it'll get us back, get us back to this, right? But that is how we factor by grouping. So first thing you want to do is look for GCF, and then you multiply your first and last terms together. And then you want to see what times what gives you that number, but adds to that middle number. And then after that, you're just grouping your first two terms and your last two terms, and you're finding the GCF of both, and then that's how you find your answer. All right? If you ever have any questions, please ask a teacher, and I'll see you next time. Bye.